every novelist, when presenting a novelist, to try to tell you the whole story, and I'm unable to resist that temptation. So I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour of my entire book, while still creating enough suspense and excitement that you'll have to buy it when I'm done. I am going to read 3 scenes, but they're very short. I've made them tiny, but almost like vignettes. And they'll just give you a taste of the book and what it's about. The protagonist of the novel is a difficult man. His name is Dr. Lee. He's an aging mathematics professor. The only woman he ever loved, his wife, left him long ago, and now she's dead, so he can't say sorry to her. His grown daughter doesn't speak to him anymore. His colleagues think he's very prickly and unfriendly, and his students don't come to his office hours, even though he sits there waiting, kind of hopefully, with his door ajar. One day, while he's sitting in his empty office hours, seething because his much more popular colleague next door had many student visitors that day, or rather the day before, he's thrown to the floor by the force of a bomb that actually has gone off in this colleague's office. I should clarify that there are no students in the office when this happens, but his colleague is grievously injured, and Lee's first thought is almost of happiness, because this man has caused him such pain in terms of envy, that his second thought is a great shame at reacting that way. Because Lee is an all-right person, although very difficult. He goes to the hospital and he's questioned by police. It was terrible, Lee said, his voice unexpectedly breaking. The retelling of it had made his skin crawl. It must be a mistake. Who would do this to him? Who would do this? Only sick people, animals. Could it have been a mistake? One of the policemen asked keenly. This was before the FBI had arrived and brusquely shunted the locals onto the sidelines. Who would want to kill us? Lee asked weakly. We're only professors. We don't do anything. Before the interrogation began, Lee had felt a raw force piling up in his gut, the pressure of which just increased as the questions wore on. Lee had thought that talking would help, but with the policeman he found himself under constant restraint, required to add qualifications to every assertion, so that by the time he was free to go home, he was quaking. Are you sure you're all right? Said the doctor who'd come to discharge him. I wonder if we ought to keep you another few hours. I'm all right, Lee practically shouted. I want to go home. Released at last, he floated down the hospital's hallways and through its main doors in surreal anonymity. But once he arrived on the sidewalk, he felt the atmosphere shifting. It was past 9 o'clock. The sidewalk approaching the hospital entrance met the curb in a T, and that T was outlined on both sides by crushed tufts of snake grass and recent tulips already losing their petals. Lee stared at the plants. They glowed a chill, livid white, as if blasted by rays of the moon. Their shadows were too long. He realized that the T was congested with people and lights, the harsh, bluish white lights of news cameras. Professor Lee, he heard someone cry then, in a voice like his daughter's. Lee swiveled his head in confusion. But before he could find her, the crowd surged toward him, stroboscopic with shadow and light. Professor Lee, said a new, sharper voice, can we ask a few questions? You were there when the bomb went off, weren't you? Yes, Lee said, on instinct pulling off his glasses as he did when he lectured. Yes, I was, he repeated. Later on, many people, colleagues, students, his neighbors, asked Lee with amazement if it was really his first time on TV, because he seemed born to it. So Professor Lee has his moment in the spotlight. He talks to the news cameras and finds with amazement the next day that he's been quoted in his local paper, and even to his secret excitement, although also slight dismay, in an AP story that runs in the New York Times. And for a brief moment, he only has this unexpected celebrity to deal with. And during that brief moment, he mows his lawn. His wife, now dead, is Eileen, who he thinks of here, and his grown daughter, now not speaking to him any longer, but who he thinks of here, is Esther. As he finished the very thin strip to the left of his driveway, which he always did for the quick, easy sense of accomplishment, the lone howl of his mower was joined by another commotion. His across-the-street neighbor's small house, the same model as his, just a little too much for an old man entirely alone, and just barely enough for a couple with a toddler and baby. Briefly quaked, then erupted, some restraint overcome. The resident toddler rushed out the front door, shrieking and naked except for a diaper, and disappeared around the side of the house with the mother and a hip-riding baby in awkward pursuit. Lee did not know the name of the toddler or even its sex, but now that he thought about it, plodding with his slight weight pressed forward against the machine, he recalled that for the past several weeks there was scarcely a day this scene wasn't enacted. The child must have just learned to walk, or to open the front door, or both. What would that be? 14 months. That was the age Esther had been when she'd worn her first shoes. The three of them had lived on Sawyer Street then, in a part of town now entirely different, for one thing entirely black. Lee hadn't been back there in years, not even to trawl the now broken streets for his best memories. But Sawyer Street existed without flaw in his mind. Their very first house, their beachhead as a new family. He and Eileen had been married 4 years. He'd had his doctor for 1. Esther had been going on 1.5. They'd had a little metal stroller for Esther that compared with the strollers of today was as crude as a Ford Model T, but Lee had approved of its ungainly weight. Perhaps because he was pushing a rolling thing now, leaned at such a sharp angle for progress that he might appear to be walking into a stiff wind. This recollection of pushing Esther overtook him completely. It fell onto him like a cloak, and now the breeze on his bare arms was balmy and sweet, and the sun had dropped off the zenith and blunted its rays. It was early morning, and his brown hands were wrapped confidently around the twin rubber handles, and he saw his smooth knees and his tan, slender shins, and the toes of his leather sandals, always almost stubbed on the stroller's big wheels. With Esther, he also leaned forward, pushed the thing with his body aslant to avoid this annoyance. A posture he dimly realized was in some way female. All the strollers were misdesigned in this way, though at the time no one called it a flaw. It was how strollers were. The handles rising straight from the rear wheels, so that you had to lean forward to not stub your toes. And this was the profile of all the neighborhood's women, and it was also Lee's profile. And he didn't mind this self-feminization. In fact, he secretly liked it. Things really unravel rapidly for Lee, as I said, in a way that you'll have to discover for yourselves. But one of the things that happens is that his brief moment of celebrity as a near victim of the bomb brings him to the attention of the FBI, who have come to town to investigate this bombing. And he soon finds that he's of particular attention to the FBI. He's become what they call a person of interest, not a suspect, which means that they can't actually charge him, but they can find him somehow particularly interesting. And they can do so in a way that's public, which means that his already shaky public persona begins to be actually tainted by false suspicion. And in this last little section that I'll read, he opens the door one morning to find that the FBI is serving a search warrant on him and that they have been accompanied by the news media, his second encounter with the news media. Lee closed the door and crept onto his bed. He hadn't pressed the button of the lock. He was afraid he might be reprimanded. He heard the thump of feet and the shifting of objects. No one pursued him now to put a camera and microphone close to his face. No one needed to, having already captured him lunging and twisting in Agent Morrison's grasp and then crazily yelling, "It's none of your goddamn business." The ceiling of this room, like the ceiling of all the rooms in his house, was done in that same textured plaster that resembled acne. Lee stared at the irregular bumps as if he might find a pattern. Through the thin walls, he heard Agent Morrison say, "Dr. Lee is a person of interest to this investigation. He is not a suspect. It's as simple as that. We have never said he's a suspect. If we ever do say it, you'll know." But what exactly do you mean by that, Agent? Is there some legal difference between the two terms? Dr. Lee is a person we've been talking to and who's fully cooperating. Is he going to face charges? Look, this isn't a briefing. You people aren't even supposed to be here. Can we expect Dr. Lee to be upgraded from a person of interest into a suspect pretty soon? Lee rolled his head back and forth, almost writhed in torment. In the kitchen, his phone began ringing. He had been so swiftly dispossessed, he felt a moment of childlike dismay that no one of the FBI agents or TV reporters took the trouble to answer it for him. Who was calling? Was it Esther? He gasped, writhed, clenched into motionlessness suddenly. From where he lay, when he looked to his right into the dresser's mirror, he saw reflected the fissure between the edge of the blinds and the frame of the window that lay to his left. The two slivers of view, reflected and real, were entirely different. Of course, this was the simplest geometry, the angles of incidence and reflection. But while the leftward view muffled itself in the bosk of a pine tree Lee had planted for privacy a few years before, the rightward just managed to escape the pine's boughs and run clear to the street. There, a knot of spectators stood talking, one of whom, as Lee watched, suddenly turned and strode straight toward the pine tree, as if he'd realized, as had Lee at that instant, that the pine tree was protective only in concert with the basic respect neighbors grant to each other, and that today the respect had been breached with remarkable speed, perhaps permanently. I saw him out in the yard once, the man called over his shoulder to his less bold companions. I don't know what the hell he was doing, digging holes in the middle of the night, maybe burying things. In fact, Lee had been planting a Japanese maple tree at the start of a summer that had been such a hell that he'd waited to dig until sunset. The delicate maple had scorched and expired within days, and then its slight skeleton, almost invisible from a few yards away, had remained memorializing itself for almost a year because Lee couldn't bear to acknowledge his failure enough to uproot it. And the following spring, he'd accidentally run into it with the lawnmower. But he was thinking of none of this now, as in a rush of pure instinct, he twisted off the bed and fell hard on the side farthest from the window. Sore and gasping, he crouched out of sight on the carpet as the man crackled past the fat pine. Unlike the maple, it had thrived, and presumably pressed his face onto the glass. Nah, nothing, the man called toward the street in a tone of apology. Lee heard the man's movement in the direction of the backyard, but remained where he was, his heart clogging his throat. He'd lain stunned and still when the force of the bomb had thrown him. As if the mnemonic conditions were ideal for the first time in weeks, Lee remembered anew, and with unsentimental precision, the impact of the floor like a swollen heartbeat in the bones of his face, and the warm tongue of blood sliding over his own, and the inaccurate, passionless thought that he'd lost all his teeth. He had nodded himself automatically like a fetus. He'd supposed then because he'd been bombed in his youth, and you never forget. But perhaps it was not a learned reflex, but a species instinct. Every animal curls into a ball when God's fist thunders him. It came to him that he'd been hearing engines departing, the dense babble of voices deflating. Now there was silence. He didn't know how long he'd been on the floor. He got to all fours with effort and lingered there before standing up, with the feeling of bearing his stomach to rows of sharpshooters. His hand lay for a while on the knob before somehow exerting the force that swung open the door. He hadn't imagined that his house, with its bare picture hooks, could look emptier. It looked roughed up and shaken down, raked. Bits of sod were mashed onto the stair treads. The front door had been left standing open. When he went to close it, he found his across-the-street neighbor, the young mother of the toddler and hip baby, standing on his stoop, her face recklessly flushed. "I just want you to know," she said, as if they were lines she had rehearsed, "that I have 2 little children, and if you so much as think about them, I will make you regret it." He gazed at her a moment. Another young woman around the same age as Esther, 25, 26. She was alone. She found someone to tend her 2 children while she accomplished this mission. It was possible to take a step backward and close the door in her face. Thank you. the most frequently asked question while people think of questions. I'm sure some of you have thought of this question, is why did I write the book? My father is a math professor, and when the Unabomber was killing math professors in the 1990s, my father was very interested in this news story for obvious reasons, and he and I followed the story closely together. We talked about it a lot on the phone. I was living in New York, and he was living in the Midwest where I was born. And when the Unabomber was arrested, it turned out that he had been my father's graduate school classmate at the University of Michigan. They had known each other, although not well, because Ted Kaczynski apparently didn't have good friends. For some reason. But they had been together in a very small doctoral program for mathematics in the early 1960s. My father remembered him very well. And it was that odd coincidence that first led me to imagine the life of an aging math professor, and then the life of an aging math professor whose life is turned upside down by sort of Unabomber-esque violence. Now someone has a question. Yes?
What was your first book about? The foreign student?
It's going to sound like I only write about my father, which is an illusion. My second book has nothing to do with my father. The question was, what is my first book, The Foreign Student, about? And it's actually about my father. It's actually a story inspired by my father. The story is of a young man who emigrates to the deep south from South Korea in the 1950s, just after the Korean War, and finds himself the only non-white student at a very traditional Episcopal university, Sewanee, in Sewanee, Tennessee. And this was basically my father's experience. My father came to Sewanee in the mid-50s from Korea. Although much of the book is fiction. Thanks. Yes?
What does your father think of you writing about him?
I actually wrote an essay about that. I actually did. My father is a mathematician, and so he's remarkably, well, it doesn't logically follow, but as a mathematician, my father's remarkably tolerant of my monopolistic liberties. His father was actually a novelist, so he thinks it's okay on some level. I think he's put up with it. Yes?
Does he think you got the mathematician professor's life right?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was really worried about it, and I actually asked him explicitly for help. There's a scene late in the book in which the wrongly accused professor actually confronts, finally, the man who actually is the bomber, who has basically, although he hasn't bombed Professor Lee, he has exploded his life. And Professor Lee confronts him and tries to connect with him, and he tries to do that by talking about their mathematical studies when they were young men. And my father basically, it was almost as if someone was writing out like Croatian or something for me to transcribe into my book. My father actually sort of helped me with a conversation that mathematicians would have. And he had to write it down because he tried to explain the principles to me, and I was like, no, just write down the words. So, and if I just keep saying to people, if the math is wrong, my father will address that question. Yes?
The protagonist sounds rather lonely and alienated, so I'm wondering if the book is largely him being introspective, or does he play off against characters?
He plays off against characters actually quite a bit. It's a really great question because I was concerned that the book would be very interior, and the passages that I've read are quite interior because they're sort of dense with stuff that's thought, stuff that happens. I should read more dialogue. He has a relationship with another professor who was sort of his only friend, also a divorced father, someone who moved away, but when his notoriety, the one sort of good outcome of his notoriety is that this professor comes and finds him and sort of stands by him. And he actually develops a very strange, almost symbiotic relationship with this agent, Agent Morrison, the FBI agent who's investigating him. They end up sort of entangled, not romantically, but psychically. The thing that happens in the book that I'm proud of, although I don't want to give it away too much, is that the relationships in his life that are really broken, namely the estrangement from his daughter, in a way that's hard to explain, but you'll have to trust me or read the book. His ordeal ends up fixing those relationships. And so although his life is sort of broken apart, it's brought together again in a better way. Thank you.